Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Riki Ellison. I'm the founder and chairman of the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance, an alliance I founded in 2002 with the sole mission of making our country and our nation safe by the deployment, the evolution, development of missile defense capabilities. I've been involved with missile defense since 1980 at the inception of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDIO, under President Reagan's team in terms of critical thinking on that. I am calling you or with you today from the state of Arizona. It's a very special place. I grew up here, spent a decade of my life here, and I went to a one-room schoolhouse with an Indian reservation and the local cowboys. And my foreman of the ranch was probably my #1 role model of my life. And he was a Sherman tank commander under General Patton in World War II and led some of the first intrusions into Germany, Battle of Bulge. And as a young boy, listening to the atrocities of the World War really has guided a deep set notion forever, never to ever have a world war happen again. And this is where we're at. And you can see on the fringes of the world today, we are very close to that. And to deter someone, we're struggling right now deterring Russia, deterring China. You obviously have to be able to impose costs, but you have to deny their cost on you, and you have to communicate that. We are not in a good position on denying cost right now from what we're seeing that's being displayed this year, particularly. 1,500 plus cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, killing people today. Western civilization doesn't have an answer for that. That has to be addressed. And we're seeing North Korea testing to intimidate us, to leverage us. We're seeing China overmatching by multiples of missile capability to enforce their will upon us. And we're seeing in the CENTCOM, in the Middle East, continual use of missiles and rockets. That is the weapon of choice today. There's no question about it. And it's going to continue to be the weapon of choice. And right now, we are not prepared to handle all of this. We lack capacity. We lack capability development. We've been living in a world over the past 20 years where there hasn't been a core major threat to us, a world war threat to us. But let these things go. We've become capability-based acquisition. We have not been threat-based acquisition. Today, right, there has to be change made. And we're delivering that process. We want a discussion with our Congress, with our president, with our administration, to be able to readdress the roles and responsibilities of integrated air and missile defense. We have not put a formal agreement. The last time we did this was 1948 at Key West. It was 2 years after brand new service, the Air Force was created, right after World War II. It was the movement that we saw at the end of World War II with V-1 cruise missiles. And that's the last time we've done this. Here we are, where we've got a new threat on top of all the cruise missiles and all the ballistic missiles. We got hypersonic threat that we don't have a defense for yet. We've got a new service, the Space Force, that doesn't have the roles and responsibilities assigned to it yet on missile defense. And we've got a declining budget. And we've got to figure out how to do this better. We cannot do what we're doing with missile defense spread all over these services, duplicating efforts and not being efficient in getting capability out to the warfighter. COCOMs, they're not getting what they want to do their mission of defending their capabilities and project forces forward. You're seeing this in Europe, you're seeing this in the first and second island chain. And most importantly, our Western world is not protecting their populations. I mean, Ukraine is showing that. It's just devastating to know that we have the capability, we have technology to be able to defeat anything they're throwing at us right now. And that's not being used. It wasn't thought through. It wasn't put in place forward. So we have to change that. So we wrote a paper. This is a report that we spent over a year on. And the intent is to make our world a safer place by putting forward a defining historical report on the history of what we did with air and missile defense and really where it's gone off balance. And I've been involved, like I said, since 1980, where a lot of these decisions on that paper have been made. And yes, we stepped back and we took the best of the best from those relationships all the way back to the 80s, the 70s, 60s to contribute to this paper. And yes, we went out to all the services, and asked for their input and reflection, including the agencies, including Congress, including the experts, to really refine this paper to be the best we could possibly do to start the discussion and the debate that this country has to have to get this right. And we have a great team. I'm a big believer in teams and the diversity of thought. And our missile defense team here at MDA is exceptional in this. And you'll hear them today. They contributed to writing this paper. Probably had 1 million edits on it. But it's the right time. It's the right time now. It wasn't the right time 6 months ago. It's the right time now to make change. So today, we're going to explain the concepts of what that paper is. Yes, we put forward some recommendations. They may not be the end of the final product of our country's decision making, but they are a start to make this our country our smartest, to be able to understand it and make the right decisions. We have to have this discussion. We have to have this debate, and we have to change the roles and responsibilities of missile defense today. So we're going to lose, and we're going to lose big. And there could be a world war coming if we don't do this. This is our segment. I know it's a very sober note. I'm going to pass it now to another fellow Arizonan. So John Rood went to high school as well here in the state of Arizona. John's former undersecretary. That's awesome. John, the floor is yours.
Well, it's great to be with you, Riki, and I wish I could be there in my home state of Arizona with you. I was born and raised in Arizona, and that's where my heart still resides. It's wonderful that you're out west, and that Western spirit that you bring to the defense of our country is really just a great contribution. First, I want to thank you and congratulate you, Riki, on getting today's report out. It's a really significant study, and I think a real achievement for MDAA under your leadership to get that out. There are a few points I wanted to highlight from the report and just bring to everybody's attention. I think first, it can't be overstated that we are witnessing the evolution of modern warfare and seeing the heavy use of missiles as a primary instrument of warfare. The war in Ukraine is just the latest example where Russia is using large numbers of missiles to strike targets in Ukraine. As you recall, on one of the MDAA roundtables like this on March 30th, U.S. Army Major General Jamie Gerard indicated that Russia had conducted over 1,300 ballistic, cruise, and hypersonic missile attacks in Ukraine. And of course, there have been more since that time. These missile attacks, I would argue, have had a much greater impact on the war than the other types of more traditional military forces that Russia has used, such as thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, helicopter attacks, airborne troop drops, and naval force attacks. Missile attacks today are a primary method of warfare, and Russia is using them in this conflict. They are a central component of modern warfare, and that's further evidence of why defending and attacking this threat needs to play a more central role in U.S. defense planning. As we saw earlier this year in the Middle East, it isn't a trend where missiles are a primary instrument of warfare that's limited just to Russia and the war in Ukraine. The frequency of missile attacks and intercepts in the Middle East by U.S. allies, in my view, has really been underreported by the U.S. media. There have been some press articles, though, such as the Wall Street Journal article on December 7th in 2021, which described the high volume of attacks we're seeing in the Middle East. And that Wall Street Journal article said, and I quote, "Over the last several months, Saudi Arabia has been attacked by nearly a dozen ballistic missile and drone strikes launched each week by the Yemen-based Houthi rebels," end quote. Tim Letterking, the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, who's a friend and colleague, stated that the Houthis have conducted 375 of these cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia in 2021. This is simply a huge volume of missile and drone attacks. And of course, the Houthis haven't limited their attacks only to attacks on the Saudis. They've also attacked U.S. forces in the region, with the U.S. and UAE crews successfully using THAAD and Patriot systems to defend our troops against those attacks. The Houthis are conducting these attacks. They're backed by Iran, and it's with Iranian assistance that they've developed and received these weapons. Large volumes of Iranian weapons have been seized by the U.S. and other international forces en route to the Houthis, including missiles and drones. During my tenure, I would add, in the Pentagon from 2018 to 2020 as undersecretary, my staff was responsible for overseeing a program where we maintained a warehouse at Bolling Air Force Base here in the Washington area, and we displayed these seized weapons to reporters and others, and there was a large diversity and large volume. This trend, I would say, though, applies across the world. China is probably the best example, where they've developed a very large arsenal of over 1,000 short and medium range missiles that are deployed facing Taiwan, as well as large numbers of intermediate and long range missiles, which are capable of targeting the United States. North Korea has a similarly large arsenal of increasingly sophisticated weapons. Iran has deployed hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles and used them in some cases in strikes against U.S. forces and our allies. And if you look in the other parts of the Middle East, like Israel, missiles and rockets, again, are the primary method of warfare that groups like Hezbollah are using in their war against Israel. We simply need to recognize this is the trend in modern warfare and respond accordingly. If we did a little analysis of our budget or focus of our services, we would not find that placed in that kind of central role, or it would be undervalued. So the second thing I'd point out that's recommended in the MDAA report is we need to substantially increase the funding for missile defense in the U.S. budget. I will say the current funding requested by the administration in its budget request last month is a bit misleading, in that billions of dollars of long-range strike systems and other areas are called missile defense, which I think mischaracterizes the amount of funding devoted to missile defense. I like long-range strike programs, but they are that. They're long-range strike programs. They're not missile defense per increase. We also recommend that DoD prioritize missile defense as a core mission. For too long, parts of the U.S. military have neglected this mission. To reverse this, we call on the Secretary of Defense to direct each of the services to treat this area, missile defense, as a core mission area and fund it accordingly. Unfortunately, we still see too many arguments that are, as mentioned in the study of the history of this, where people would say, well, gee, it's cost imposing on the United States to pursue missile defense. And that's been proven false in terms of an argument by history. If you look at the amount of cost imposition that missile defenses have imposed on Russia, as an example, and China, other US adversaries, where they are investing in capabilities like undersea transoceanic torpedoes, other methods to evade and try to counter U.S. missile defenses in other ways, we've really had a cost imposing effect on others. And the reality is, in every other area of our defense doctrine, the cost of a bullet is quite small. The cost of the defense, where we armor our troops, we place them in armored transport vehicles, we place them away from that danger, costs far more than the cost of the offense. But for some reason, this gets applied in missile defense in a ways that stunts our thinking and fails to recognize you've got to have the ability to deal with the adversary use of missiles. You have to have a sufficient volume and sophistication of your defenses such that your forward bases can operate, such that you can fight through a conflict like we're seeing in Ukraine, and that you can effectively attrit those that are firing at you. But that's got to require a certain volume of defenses to enable offenses to be utilized effectively. Third thing I'd point out is that the Defense Department needs to take steps to much more rapidly develop and field missile defenses. In the roles and responsibilities report, MDA points out that, in our history, the periods of the most rapid progress have been when we've had a single organization empowered to make that kind of rapid progress. Like when President Eisenhower created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, which was later renamed DARPA. President Reagan created SDIO, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, or in the initial instantiation of the Missile Defense Agency, which was created during the George W. Bush administration. And here, some might say, well, gee, what's wrong with our current system? Well, our current system is that the military services and other parts of the Defense Department, on average, take 10 to 15 years to field a new capability. That simply won't keep pace with the threat and is not the kind of slow pace of innovation and deployment that we need, especially in a critical mission area, and we don't have to accept that. So we recommend that MDA is the lead architect, or the Missile Defense Agency is the lead architect for missile defense, should have its original rapid acquisition authorities restored so it can quickly develop and field missile defense systems to deter and defeat ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missiles. As originally envisioned at MDA's founding, we also recommend that once these systems are developed by MDA, they should be transferred to the military services for rapid, full-rate production and sustainment. MDA needs to be focused on rapid R&D and fielding of new capabilities. The bureaucratic structures that limit and restrict this progress should be removed. For example, we argue for the elimination of the Missile Defense Executive Board, which is a very heavily bureaucratic structure, and having spent hours in that body myself, I really question the utility of it. And that forces MDA to frankly behave like the other traditional DoD development organizations with very similar slow results, which are more costly than they should be. The urgency of the threat just won't allow this kind of long duration development to be our primary approach. MDA is a lead system architect for missile defense across all domains, and you need a lead system architect, and they should be fully resourced and authorized to rapidly and efficiently develop defenses for both cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missile threats. Secretary of Defense, in my view, our view, should return the original rapid acquisition authorities to MDA that existed at its founding in 2002 to allow us to move much more rapidly. And these included being relieved from the obligations imposed by the JROC and the strict adherence to the DoD 5000 series acquisition regulations. And that includes the MDA director having the authorities to function as a component acquisition executive. MDA, in our view, would develop systems through low rate initial production and then transfer the systems to the services for full rate production. And the services would be required to budget for that production and fielding. The MDA budget would not be transferred to the services for this purpose. The services would need to begin budgeting for that. They've been directed to do so before. They've just not followed through on that instruction. And then after MDA transferred a missile defense system that it completed R&D to the service, MDA could shift resources to the next highest priority capability development. And MDA would be responsible for the ongoing capability upgrades. It's just that the production and sustainment would be the responsibility of the service. So some would say, well, why should we do this when we have something that works today? Again, it's too expensive and takes far too long. And we saw the difference after MDA's founding in 2002 and the power of these expanded authorities. For those that aren't familiar with that history, in less than 2 years following a decision to deploy a system, the initial deployment of the first operational ground-based interceptors at Fort Greely and Vandenberg, California began, along with the necessary sensors, along with a sea-based X-band radar, along with a new command and control system operated by the National Guard in 2 years. And then over the course of the next 4 years with these rapid acquisition authorities, MDA would field other capabilities like Patriot PAC-3, SM-3 Block 1A, interceptors on Aegis ships, the THAAD system, and other additional ground-based interceptors and sensors. That's what rapid acquisition capability looks like, and we need to stop treating MDA like the rest of the Defense Department programs. Otherwise, we're going to have similar results as the rest of the Defense Department programs, which are 10 to 15-year development cycles, which cost too much. So fourth recommendation, we need to get the U.S. military services more engaged on missile defenses. One of the things that we're concerned about is that the Army has underfunded and under-resourced this critical area. That's not surprising to me, given that the other missions that the Army has had, but I think they've been slow to recognize the threat to their forces. I mean, after all, it's been since World War II, because of the strong U.S. Air Force, since a U.S. soldier was attacked from the air. Although I would say, while we use that line, we don't include things like in January, where U.S. forces were attacked by a ballistic missile launched from Iranian-backed proxies, or times when the Iranian forces themselves launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at U.S. forces. So I do think we've got too much duplication today among the military services, which we really can't afford. One of the areas that I differ with the recommendations in the report is that I think we should see the Air Force given this mission. That's what virtually every other effective military around the world has done, where they've given responsibility for air defense to their Air Force, given the synergies that are available for using a combination of ground and airborne and elevated sensors and interception systems to combine for an effective defense against cruise, ballistic, and air threats. That was the plan you'll read in the paper at the founding of the U.S. Air Force in 1947. The President and the Secretary of Defense directed that and made the Air Force responsible for air and missile defense. But as we see throughout our history, this is a very common repeating theme, not just in missile defense, but the military services tend to resist those things and try to have a series of capabilities solely resident within their own service, as opposed to relying on others. And we saw in the history there, Army playing a much greater role over time and pushing back against decisions by the Secretary of Defense and others to limit their role, and eventually taking the lead role on missile defense for ground-based study. But I think this is not efficient, and this is something, for example, RAND studied in 2002 and reached the conclusion that the Air Force should take the lead. You saw former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, McPeak, arguing for this. I think that's where I would like to see us go. Because today, given the inherent limitations and difficulty in detecting and intercepting low-flying cruise missiles using ground-based radars and interceptors, say operated by the Army, as opposed to the advantages of airborne sensing and defense from unmanned and manned aircraft and lofted sensors, just another reason why the optimization of that, I think, should be given to the Air Force. A couple other recommendations that are important that we put forward: the Space Force being responsible for the overall sensor architecture in the space domain, to include sensors contributing to the missile defense mission. And then the National Guard to be the group that mans, trains, and operates U.S. homeland defenses and MD sites for sensors, interceptors, and command and control. I would argue that should also include defending Guam and Hawaii as additional capabilities are fielded. So that's just a few of the recommendations that we put forward. But again, I want to come back to a kind of fundamental point. The war in Ukraine is a good illustration of how the nature of warfare is shifting. For example, we're seeing there's always a balance between mass, mobility, firepower, things of that nature, fundamental qualities of warfare. But one of the areas we're seeing tilted is the disadvantages, or I should say it better, the reduced advantages by mass of armored forces, massed concentrations of ground forces being very vulnerable when you have the ability to maintain information, a situational awareness of where those forces are through airborne assets like the drones that Ukraine is employing very effectively, to coordinate with fires like long-range artillery to destroy those armored formations, and the role that precision and the low cost of precision and the ability to strike at range is providing against those concentrations. And the same thing is true with aircraft and helicopters, where you're seeing attrition of those forces, but missiles, cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles playing a much larger role. Other types of forces like cyber forces being very active. So it doesn't mean we don't need those capabilities, but we have to adjust the balance at which we're applying those and recognize these shifts. So anyways, that's enough for me. Riki, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to the Q&A.
John, I'm going to follow up with one question from your vast experience. How many of these recommendations, when can they get done realistically? Is it next year? If this gets through Congress administration, what's your thought process and how soon can we make change?
Well, I think it depends on if the spirit is willing in places like either the Congress or the administration in the form of the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, or senior officials, if there's a buy-in and a support, changes can happen very rapidly. It's more common, unfortunately, that folks are used to a current system. They tend to try to repel or oppose change. And so in those cases, it obviously will take much longer. I've been involved in cases where we put in place, using the authorities resident in the Defense Department, changes very quickly. And I've also been involved in situations earlier in my career as a Hill staffer where the administration didn't support certain recommendations and the Congress imposed it on them anyways. You look back over our history, things like Goldwater nickels being imposed by Barry Goldwater from the state of Arizona, and others on the military, and the transformative effect that it had. So I think it can happen quickly. And I will say, in case it comes across that I'm being too critical of our the people we admire so much in uniform, I'm not. I mean, when you work and you're amongst them, one of the things that is just amazing is to see the quality and caliber and commitment of those folks. And it sounds very trite and simple, but look at the war in Ukraine and the difference that makes. There are technologies being applied, but the fundamental difference in the forces is the will to fight, the commitment to the mission, and the commitment to each other. And it makes you about teary-eyed sometimes when you're around U.S. military officers leading their forces, and the esprit de corps and the willingness to sacrifice and do whatever is required for their fellow service member. That, look at what's going on in Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces have that temper and fighting will. The Russian forces do not. And so despite all the advantages, look at the difference there. And so sometimes I think when people do things and question affecting that military culture we have, they don't understand in the same way that Mark and Ty have, who have spent their career there, just how vital and central that has to be to our effectiveness. And we can't take that for granted.
Thank you, John. And I greatly appreciate your academic thought, your independence and courage to say the truth. So I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. We also have another link to Arizona. Mark Montgomery was Senator John McCain's lead aide at the Senate Armed Service Committee for a few years. And Mark is exceptional, retired.
Summary of the report. What I want to do is dig into, talk a little bit about what we've learned in Ukraine with Russia, and dig into two of the areas that I think it really causes us to need to take action. And the first thing I'll say is I want to answer one part of your question. How fast can they do it? The missile defense, the issue of restoring MDA's acquisition, rapid acquisition authorities could be done in a week, honestly. Now, as John would say, that takes a political will that may take a year or 2 years or never, but the actual process is a week. Some of the other things we recommend in here take years, maybe a half a decade, but that's one that could be fixed immediately, and probably of all our recommendations would have the most powerful impact. It was a bad process decision, probably arrived at through, the observation of some poor practices, but instead of fixing the practices, they altered the process. And what we need to do is get a good MDA process, good, effective MDA process in place. And I'll explain why in a moment. First, I do want to say the lessons learned from Russia, look, and a lot of us I worked at U.S. European Command in the J5 as a 1-star, spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I'm surprised with how well they've done, and I worked closely with many of the officers involved in this. But, and the performance of the Russian army as a large-scale maneuver army has surprised me in a good way, that they haven't been that. But let's be clear, their cruise missile and ballistic missile attacks have been effective. They're not 90% effective like our cruise missiles. Maybe they're 70% effective, but 70% times 1,300 is a lot of effectiveness, right? That means 1,000 missiles have hit where they intended, and they have hurt the Ukrainian army. They've hurt them at ammo depots. They've hurt their Air Force at airfields. They've hurt both services at their logistics depots. They've hurt infrastructure. They have been effective. Some of their targeting has disappointed us. I tend to think that's more artillery and errant missiles, but their missile attacks have been effective, and that should be a sharp lesson learned for us, because China has more missiles than Russia. When you add up the SRBMs, IRBMs, and cruise missiles facing Taiwan, for example, or the southern islands of Japan. And something else that's demonstrated in this is the first mover advantage. Authoritarians are going to have the first mover advantage. The Biden administration, to their credit, was announcing Russia's intentions for weeks ahead of time, but because of the authoritarian regime, they still had first mover advantage. Democracies don't initiate these wars of choice easily. Authoritarian regimes do. So that first mover's advantage is important, and China will learn a big lesson from that, which is that restraint in using that first mover advantage hurt Russia. They showed restraint, thinking that there'd be massive defections and it'd be a quick win, not wanting to do much damage. They showed restraint. I think what we can learn from this is China, when they use that first mover advantage with ballistic and cruise missiles, will probably go all in. That means a lot for missile defense. It means that we don't just have to have capability, but we have to have capacity. And that's where we hurt. Even sometimes when we develop the sweetest missile defense system, it tends to come at a cost that causes us to have a capacity that's fairly low. And you can think about some of our sea-based systems or things like THAAD and Patriot, where our numbers really don't do service to the threat. So, that what I've learned from Russia are those kind of things. So when I apply it, there's two thoughts here. The first is what we haven't seen here, and despite press reporting, we really haven't seen hypersonic missiles yet. They're not really at that level of development that you're going to see, kind of full-scale hypersonic glide vehicles, things like that, in combat for several years. But I do tell you what should be concerning us, and that is that hypersonic missiles are going to be in the field before hypersonic defense. So the number one reason that we need to give MDA back, the Missile Defense Agency, back its rapid acquisition authorities, and so that it can aggressively address this hypersonic problem. I promise you, the services will not solve it. They don't intend to solve it. They're going to allow Missile Defense Agency to solve it. If we use the traditional DoD acquisition system, we'll have a high-quality hypersonic defense out there within 10 to 15 years. The problem is the adversary is going to have a high-quality hypersonic attack capability in 3 to 5 years. If you want to square those numbers, you got to give MDA the ability to take risk, to have a rapid acquisition authority process, and to do it now. That is something that needs to be signed this week, this month, this quarter, no later. And you need to give Admiral Hill and his team at the Missile Defense Agency the resources and the authorities to tackle this head on. Why this really matters is the idea of deterrence. Deterrence doesn't work against a first mover, i.e. an authoritarian state, who believes he has an ability to take all your systems out. So the degree to which they build hypersonic attack and we do not build hypersonic defense, all our other investments lose their deterrent value as the adversary says, well, I can take out that aircraft carrier. I can take out that airfield. I can take out that logistics stowage site in Poland or Germany or Belgium or the Netherlands, where we store all our equipment. So we really have to get at this hypersonic defense threat. We have to give the Missile Defense Agency the resources and the authorities they need to tackle it. So that's the first big, you know, as I said, if any one thing could get done from this paper with the snap of our fingers, I think all of us would agree, it's get the MDA that rapid acquisition authority. Now, the second issue I was going to tackle real quick is the Army and cruise missile defense. And obviously, I'll take a slightly different tack than John Rood. We ended up with the idea that the Army needs to get this missile done. And I don't want to go through the whole history of, you know, the Trail of Tears of Slam Ram, MEADS, even Sergeant York, if you go way back with the Division of Air Defense. We have not done well since we laid up the Hawk and the Hawk and improved Hawk air defense systems that were the backbone of our air defense against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. And as we got rid of that system, our failure to replace it, because the Army had legitimate other #1 priorities, particularly after 2001, has left us with a real hole in our swing. We do not have a cost-effective short to medium range air defense system. The Patriot can do cruise missile defense, but it does it at a very high cost, $3, $4, $5 million a round, which is not cost effective with an adversary. It does it at the expense of doing some of its SRBM, its short range ballistic missile defense mission. And we just don't have the capacity to do it everywhere we need to do cruise missile defense. So we absolutely positively have to get a short range cruise missile defense system out there. The Congress noted this 4 years ago now, almost 5 years ago, told the Army to do it. Recommended the Army go buy a system called NASAMS. The Army was smarter and bought a system called Iron Dome, and then very quickly realized that Iron Dome doesn't do cruise missile defense. So we went through a game there, spent quite a bit of funds, and ended up with nothing. But the Army has a program called Indirect Fire Protection Capability. I would challenge to ask 100 Army general officers what the name of their short-range air defense system is in development. And if 50 of them could say indirect fire protection capability, I'd be a little bit surprised. But that is the heart of their investment that has to happen. And so what John said earlier, that the Secretary of Defense has to direct the Army to do this, I'm afraid they have to direct the Army to do it, because the Army, knowing they had this IFPC issue, that's the acronym, for the last 5 years of going nowhere, in the meantime, identified a new mission called Mobile SHORAD, defending air defense of their maneuver battalions, and developed, funded, and is beginning to acquire 100 mobile SHORAD units. In other words, when the Army wants to be good at missile defense, they can be good at missile defense. The Secretary of Defense just has to make them want to be good at this short and medium range cruise missile defense that's critical. And I'll give you one good example. What we saw from the Russians was their ability during this attack to hit warehouses and stowage units that held Ukrainian military goods. Well, we did a fantastic job during the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations of spending nearly $26 billion in the European Deterrence Initiative to place, in the end, about $14 billion worth of tracked and wheeled vehicles all over Europe, in what are basically undefended storage units, because we don't have the missile defense systems surrounding them to keep them protected in the early stages of a conflict. So the idea is our forces would fly over and within 72 hours fall on all this equipment. Well, that doesn't work if in the first 7 hours the adversary is slamming all these warehouses with cruise missiles. So we obviously need to get cruise missiles into the field rapidly to protect the Army's significant investment in the stowed gear in Europe. Why we have to explain this to the Army is beyond me. It is just jaw-dropping that this hasn't been part of their planning from the very beginning, but it clearly hasn't, because they have put IFPC to the side while they develop M-SHORAD. So all the M-SHORAD vehicles stowed in Europe will be taken out by the cruise missiles for which they did not build their IFPC system. All right, enough complaining about the Army. What I'll say is the Army absolutely has to invest in it. The kind of money that they have set aside in the system is low. They've set a contract with Dynetics to deliver a system. The first ones are supposed to come in fiscal year 23. I'll kind of believe it when I see it, because we've been hearing about IFPC coming in 2 years for about the last 8 years. But we absolutely have to stay on top of the Army to deliver this system. So if I go back and just summarize it, two big issues have to be tackled by us. One, we have to invest in our hypersonic defense so that we don't get too far behind the rabbit in terms of Russian and Chinese development of hypersonic attack. And two, we absolutely have to lean into the Army to develop and procure in significant numbers cruise missile defense. And yes, this is rocket science, but cruise missile defense is doable. The type of systems we're advocating for are operated by Lithuania, Portugal, Norway, Denmark. The Dutch. I'm pretty sure you can add the U.S. Army to the list of armies that can operate this gear if we procure it from her. So we absolutely have to get at this short and medium range cruise missile defense built in a reasonably cost-effective way to allow us to defend our critical ground-based assets in Asia and Europe during a conflict with China or Russia. Riki, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I just want you to elaborate a little bit on how, obviously the first point you said we can get done very quickly. How about the second point? How much more time and effort are you gonna, on your viewpoint, that the Army has to get this right before you move it to the Air Force?
Well, I'm glad you allowed me to jump right back in on the Army issue again, because I don't get enough of it. But seriously, this is fixable. Look, the Army determined they had this M-SHORAD issue, this Defense of the River Brigades, and basically, took charge and moved out, and they got it done rapidly. If they make it a priority, they can do it. And again, while this is rocket science, it's rocket science that has been figured out by companies in the United States, Norway, and Israel, and it's being operated by armies from Portugal to Lithuania. I'm confident the U.S. Army can both design, develop, procure, and field the system rapidly. And by rapidly, I mean they could meet their fiscal year 23 deadline. They won't meet it if they apply their normal level of prioritization to this. And if you read every document coming out from the Army right now, IFPC is not listed as a priority. If you talk to every COCOM commander, it is a priority. So, I mean, there's a total mismatch between what the warfighters need and what the Army is producing. And that's not acceptable.
But Mark, even if this goes forward and they get the FPIC, which we're confident they will, how are they going to defend all the bases, all the Air Force bases?
Yeah.
That capacity number is tremendous. It's a huge shift of Army spending to do something like that.
Yeah, I'd have to take a look again. I think the Cold War numbers were 26 to 30 battalions. There's a lot of them. Now, look, I'm not advocating for those kind of numbers, but they are going to have to put Army TOA into this mission. I think one of the pieces of trepidation on not stepping out on development and initial procurement is they kind of know what the final cost is going to be in terms of not just the TOA for procurement, but what it takes to life cycle maintenance in terms of personnel, constant maintenance. Missile defense is not a cheap mission. It takes really smart soldiers. And it takes a decent number of them, to operate. Not just, we have a good radar, the 48, especially version 4. I mean, we are good at this when we want to be. The Army just needs to be told to prioritize being good at it.
Thank you, Mark. And we're going to go right into Ty to handle that, the Air Force perspective. But the one thing that we didn't discuss in much detail is the Space Force's future role in roles and responsibilities. We talked about the sensor integration. What about the effectors? What about how that evolves, and do you set that? Have we set that in this paper to get that moving to where it needs to go?
Is that for Ties to kick it off as a retired Air Force officer, or for me?
You know what? I'm going to let Ty.
I want to let Ty answer. I mean, we all know the Space Force is just an extension of the Air Force. I mean,
you've given Ty a lot of big hits here right now. So he's got a big plate to fill for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll introduce Ty, former Deputy Indo-PACOM PACAF commander, and also over in Europe. He's been great. All right, your view, Ty. It's on you.
Okay, thanks, Riki. And like John and Mark, both congratulations to you personally and MDAA writ large for getting this out. The other two, on the screen here, and I'm a latecomer to it in the sense of I only, started on this effort in October. I'm glad to have been part of it, but much of the heavy lifting was done by others. I guess, can I get to the Space Force as I'm working my way through a couple things? Because Mark and John really, I want to pivot off a couple things that they mentioned and then go into some of the stuff that I have prepared, because they really hit on some key points. I mean, John's identification of, what the world is like now as it is and going to be, not as we wish it to be, critical. I'm going to hit on long range strike for a second as a part of missile defense, because I think that's really important. So in theory, yes, long range strike could be part of missile defense. If you can get their effectors, their offensive weapons left of launch, you're winning. You're winning every single time. Okay, and you can do that kinetically or non-kinetically. Let's remember, though, particularly in the long list of opponents who have high volume, precision, ballistic and cruise missile fires, they're probably going to be launching them from where? Their homeland. Okay, so now going back to the perspective that I approach this with is from those two particular jobs you mentioned, joint employment, especially in a role as an area air defense commander and a combined force air component commander. Yeah, you're going to want to hit those things, and you may even have the capabilities, but you're not likely to have the authorities, particularly at the beginning of the fight. So I want to deconstruct a little bit, and John didn't assert it, but anybody out there who is saying, oh yeah, if you just take care of long range strike, you'll get everything left of launch and life is good. You don't need active missile defenses. I don't agree with that. And I don't think the evidence suggests that we're going to be able to use those early on in a conflict because we won't have the authorities. Mark's point about capability, which we have some pretty good capabilities, but we don't have the capacity, is so important. And I think that's part of the nearer term solutions that MDAA is talking about in the R&R, about pressure on the Army, because those are available and they're just not putting them out. That capacity is a critical point. And then Mark hit, well on MDA, the relationship on hypersonic defenses, and then IFPC in the near term. So let me pivot to kind of heads on the service element to this. And what I'll start off with is, the jobs that I've had, there is one part of the Army that I would love to be in the Air Force, because those soldiers are so close to the idea of what we need to do as the area air defense commander, and that's the missile defenders in the Army. They are awesome. And they also fit incredibly well into the joint force, and because they understand that missile defense in total is a joint endeavor. And it's never not going to be, because we're going to have capabilities resident in each one of the services, and they all have to work together for the area air defense commander who's working on behalf of the combatant commander. It just has to work that way. So the problem is that the missile defenders are this one small segment of the Army, and Big Army is not supporting it. So if you're out there and you're from Big Army, I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you that this should be a punch or a shove in the chest to you about what Big Army hasn't been doing on missile defense. Okay. Other priorities have been, long range strike is one of them. Let's ask ourselves, should we be resourcing more missile defense or a long range hypersonic weapon? Or to Mark's point about resourcing MSHORAD, but not resourcing IFPC, and thus the MSHORAD capabilities are actually at risk because they're never going to get out of the barn. This is something that the report clearly says the Army has played a central role. The Army may not play a central role in the future if it doesn't treat it with the gravity and the serious that it deserves, this mission, missile defense. And so, we had a lot of discussions, and the report comes just short of recommending a transfer of the mission. As we talked about it, there's a lot of second and third order effects to that first order effect of transferring the mission. And that's why I've come to the conclusion that not yet. Give the Army one more chance with a really hard shove in the chest to say, this is really important, do it. And if they don't, then the Secretary of Defense needs to intervene, and we probably need to study about transferring the mission. Intermediate steps. So we have a recommendation in there that the Air Force should have the authority to be able to procure, not develop. That's important that verb's not in there. Procure and field and sustain missile defense forces for their expeditionary maneuver units. All words chosen carefully. So we're not talking about Air Force picking up the authority to defend Hickam Air Force Base or Ramstein Air Base. What we are talking about is the Air Force picking up authorities to be able to protect maneuver forces, Air Force organic maneuver forces that are otherwise not going to be covered by the Army or Navy. So let's use the example in the Pacific and agile combat employment. This is really important because especially the terrain of the theater is different than Europe. You have a lot of island locations. You have a massive geographic space. Your maritime forces are going to be, which are very capable of missile defense, but they're either going to be defending themselves or they're going to be elsewhere. You're going to have some Army forces that are going to be doing theater air defense, okay, and they may be doing some point defense, but they're probably not at the small island location where you've got a small number of fighters and a couple hundred airmen, and they're fighting their way through the missile attacks that they're getting from the PRC to generate the defensive counter-air lanes and the offensive strike that we may get out of our fighters. So you've got to be able to do something to protect them, and in the absence of the capacity that the Army needs to be able to produce, the Air Force is motivated to do it. Whether they produce the resource or not, open question, and the challenge is over to the Air Force. But you can't have that. The Air Force can't make those choices unless they have the authority to do it. So that's the reason why I think it's really powerful that this report does recommend that the Air Force have the authority to procure and sustain missile defenses for their expeditionary maneuver forces. Let's go over to Space Force. Okay, I think a really big important point you bring out, Ricky, is Space Force as a service responsibility for the sensor architecture in the space domain. Makes perfect sense. Okay, Space Force, though, can't be going off on its own and focusing purely on the missions that are important to the Space Force, which there are a lot of them, but they also have to focus on the fact that the sensor architecture that they're responsible for is a key contributor to the success of missile defense. And so the report clearly states that Space Force, with that new responsibility, needs to coordinate with those users to include specifically MDA. Here's the good news. Recent article, I think was about 10 days ago, talks about the Space Force doing that exactly, which is apparently they're establishing a memorandum of agreement with MDA on the development of the space architecture, sensor architecture, so that those kind of equities from MDA do come in. So whether we intended it or not, that's happening already, and that's a good thing. Space Command, different thing, combatant command, but what the report recommends, and John may have touched on that briefly, is basically take on the roles and responsibilities that U.S. Stratcom had. And that seems to make sense because with the division of labor between those two commands, Space Command is more appropriate, and one of its components obviously is a Space Force, and we just talked through the sensors. I want to talk a little bit on non-kinetics and make sure that we know that the report calls out that distinctly and calls for MDA as part of their solutions that they develop for missile defense architecture, that they focus and leverage the work that the service has done on directed energy, particularly lasers and high-power microwaves, which the magazines that come with that type of technology, we all know are, theoretically unlimited, only by the power that you can put into the system. And so for the cases where we can't address the threat that way, that may be the optimal solution and the lowest cost to defeat some of the cost curve questions. So I think that's really important that the report calls that out. And then I think the last one that I'll probably hammer on is the important add of land attack cruise missile defense to MDA's portfolio. I mean, that's new and that's different. I think part of why MDAA is recommending that is because the proliferation, but also the precision of the land attack cruise missile, and the fact that some of the same sensors and some of the same capabilities for ballistic missile defense are also appropriate for cruise missile defense. And so if MDA is doing one, why not have them do both? Now, important distinction, and again, words chosen carefully, we did not say anti-ship cruise missiles. So just for the audience to make clear, and that's because a discrete enough target in a discrete environment that the U.S. Navy has handled that mission well and will continue to do that because that's them defending maneuver forces. And so the report doesn't call for MDA to pick up that particular mission. But land attack cruise missiles, definitely the report calls out for that. So I think I'm going to pause there, Ricky. We're getting pretty close to the hour, and I know we need to get to questions, but I'll turn it back over to you.
One quick thing, Ty, on the space and cost effectiveness. So space would have to defend its assets and you call it missile defense or space defense, that's in space. And the effectors, it just touch that real quick. Is that got to be organic, built by Space Force, or is it with MDA, or is it allowable through policy now to start looking at effectors that have got to be done to protect all those satellites up there? We have to do that anyways. I'm just throwing that in there to make sure we touch it.
Well, I mean, if the question is how are we going, how does this report address the idea of breaking an opponent's kill chain to try to produce a kinetic or non-kinetic effect against our own satellites, you know, various missions for them? I think at a bare minimum, the kinetic approach to it, just a direct ascent ASAT, your ability to affect that is similar to a ballistic missile in the sense that it's the same type of platform that's coming up at you. So our missile defenses would, I think, be part of that. I would start to limit it there, though, because if you have on-orbit effects and there's, you know, you can walk through all the various elements of how you kinetically or non-kinetically affect. Some of those things are outside MDA's swing, so to speak, outside the strike zone, and others can and will be doing that. And so that's, I think you make the division of labor on where the similarities are and where they end, and go from there. Over.
Thank you.
Hey,
All right, Mark.
Ricky, I've got the questions, from the group. I know we don't have much time. I picked out the best one. I think it's for John. Good question here. What did you all say about directed energy and the role in that and looking at future roles and responsibilities for missile defense?
Directed energy is an area that's critical, and as Ty mentioned, not only speed of light weapons, but high power microwave weapons, where, you know, our view was that the Defense Department has under-resourced those things. If you looked at kind of a word count, you would see a very high volume of words devoted to this. And then if you looked at a dollar count, you would not find that in the Defense Department's budget in terms of prioritization and resourcing. And, you know, having participated in some of those discussions, you'll hear the counter arguments to funding those. Well, the level of maturity of the technology is not high enough yet to field it. Therefore, we shouldn't fund it at a large amount. But to me, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyone involved in technology development efforts knows you have to fund them. You have to work. You have to overcome the barriers to bring them out. And frankly, you know, lasers is the only technology that I can think of at the moment in my lifetime that have come slower than everyone expected. So what we recommend is directed energy weapons, high power microwave, A, be given a higher priority, B, be part of the mission set for the Missile Defense Agency as the lead architect to architect those things. And the same way that kinetic systems are done, that they be developed by MDA, but employed, that is operated, sustained, and the full rate production being handled by the services. In the same way, the other types of systems for missile defense that we have are done. But I will say I'm disappointed that both when I served and otherwise, we just haven't put enough priority in these areas in terms of dollars.
Yeah, I would say that we did, all of us who edited this document and worked on the document felt that directed energy was had high potential, but currently low return, and something we need to keep focusing on. And the services do need to keep working the programs they have in process. There's been a little bit of success in some of the services, and they should continue to exploit that. Hey, there's time for one more question, Ricky. It's a good one. It's a fair one. Probably any of us could take it. We'll start with John, though. It's, hey, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles have been used heavily by Russia against Ukraine and President Zelensky, but they haven't deterred him. Wouldn't it? And there's a decent argument that if he'd had offensive weapons, Russia might not have attacked. Doesn't this argue that you don't need to make that, you know, that the investments ought to be on the offensive side of the ledger and not the defensive side? Rick, John, you first.
I would argue, look, contemporary deterrence requires both offenses and defenses, and I think it'd be a false perception to think you can do this with one or the other. You're going to need both. But as Ty did a great job mentioning, it sounds very good academically to say, well, if I know someone's going to shoot missiles at me, why don't I just attack the missiles with a long-range missile? Or the fact that I could strike with long-range capabilities will prevent the adversary from launching in the first place. And what I'd say is that just hasn't been proven true in history. If you look at our recent experience where we knew the Iranians were going to launch either missiles or attack us in some way with their forces after the strike on General Soleimani, having served in the Pentagon at that time, we were trying to de-escalate that conflict, and therefore attriting the offensive force by using long-range strike was not an option. You can say the same thing in a potential conflict with North Korea, or take the situation where the Biden administration was correctly warning Ukraine would be invaded by Russia. The Ukrainians could have struck north, but they didn't want to start a war, and so they chose not to. And you could go on and on down the line. And I think, as Mark pointed out, this is going to be a very predictable occurrence. So you're going to need defenses. Do you need 100% of the ability to negate 100% of the attacker, if you will, only with defenses? Well, of course not. We don't do that in any other military area, and we shouldn't do that in missile defense. But offenses alone will not be sufficient to deter attack. And you would not want to give someone like Kim Jong-il the ability to say, well, look, if he launches a nuclear weapon at Washington and incinerates the city, we'll simply respond with offenses. You don't want to be in that situation. That's why we need robust missile defenses.
Okay, I think that's great. Let's just close out with a statement, and we'll finish this session. So, Ty, could you sum up?
Yeah, Ricky, thank you. All I would say to wrap up is for those in the audience that are out there that have the opportunity to act on the recommendations that are in the MDAA roles and responsibilities report. Please engage us. If you don't understand what it is what's in the report, let's talk about it, and then please act on it. Because, as John put it at the very beginning, time is of the essence. The nature of war the character of war has changed, and we don't have the sufficient capabilities and especially the capacity. And if we don't do something, we're going to be on the wrong foot in the Pacific, in Europe, as we've seen in the Middle East. And we can do better than that, and we owe it to ourselves to do better. So thanks. I look forward to it. Over.
John?
Well, I'll be brief and just say again, it's a call to action that we put forward. We really just need to take seriously this moment in time. We're fortunate that U.S. forces and the United States allies are not under the type of withering attack we're seeing in Ukraine, but we are seeing that elsewhere in the world. And so we just can't take our eye off of that. We need to take it seriously. And some of these changes we're recommending would be hard, but if it was easy, it would have been done already. And so I would argue, now is the time for leadership. And thanks for convening us, and congratulations again, Ricky, on getting this important report out.
Thank you, John. Mark?
Two statements. One, give the Missile Defense Agency restore its rapid acquisition authorities that it had for its first 15 years or 17 years. And second, fully resource ground-based cruise missile defense of our fixed sites around Europe and the Pacific, so that we're ready for China and Russia. Over to you, Ricky.
Thank you, Mark. Gentlemen, thank you, and all that's not here for contributing to this report. It's a remarkable report, and we are 100% going to drive this. We are 100% going to put this in play to make this happen, or to force the debate. It has to happen. Our country, people at stake around the world, has to have this change. We're the leader. We're the leader of the civilized world. Sustain world order, to sustain deterrence, this has to be fixed. We're going to drive it with everything we got, and everybody we know. We're going to bring it to make it what our mission is, making this world and our nation safer with the deployment and development of missile defenses. We have to do this, and we're leading with this paper. So thank you for contributing, and it's a great team. One team, baby. One team, one fight. Let's go get it. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ricky.